In northern Scotland, the dead have begun to correct the living. For centuries, the Picts were treated like a people who appeared from the edge of the map and then disappeared back into it. Roman writers called them painted barbarians beyond the wall. Medieval chroniclers said their language was gone. Later histories placed them inside the broad, comfortable category of Celtic Britain, as though that single word could explain who they were, where they came from, and why they vanished. But the stones they left behind never made the story feel complete. Across the highlands and eastern coasts, Pictish symbols still stand carved into rock. Animals, mirrors, crescents, broken lines, shapes that look deliberate but refuse to speak clearly. They seem like the remains of a vanished civilization. A final message from a people erased by conquest, language change, and time. Then scientists examined something older than the stones. They looked inside the bones. Ancient DNA from Pictish burial sites revealed a result that did not fit the old story. The Picts were not outsiders from some distant eastern homeland. They were not a simple invading Celtic people who swept into northern Britain. They were deeply rooted in the same landscapes where their graves were found. And the most unsettling discovery was not that the Picts were misunderstood. It was that they had never truly disappeared. Their ancestry still survives in people living in Scotland today. So the mystery is no longer where the Picts went. The mystery is how a population that stayed in place came to be remembered as vanished. To understand why this correction matters, the old version has to be rebuilt first. The Picts entered written history through outsiders. They were not describing themselves. They were being described by Rome, from the southern side of a frontier. Beyond Hadrian's Wall, and later beyond the Antonine Wall, northern Britain became a place where imperial certainty weakened. Roads ended, records thinned, names became less precise. By the late 3rd century, Roman writers were using the name Picts for the peoples beyond their control. The word is usually linked to the Latin idea of painted people, a reference to bodies marked or decorated in ways that seemed strange to Roman observers. From the beginning. Then, the Picts were partly a description and partly a distance. Later writers made that distance larger. The 8th century monk Bede preserved a story that placed their origin far away, in Scythia, beyond the Black Sea. According to the legend, they sailed west in ships, reached Ireland first, were refused land there, and then crossed into the empty north of Britain. They were said to have taken Irish wives and accepted a rule that kingship could pass through the female line. It was a powerful origin story because it explained everything at once. Their strangeness, their separation, their apparent difference from the peoples around them. But it also rested on a dangerous assumption. It treated a political name as if it were a bloodline. It treated a medieval legend as if it were a migration record. And it treated the north of Britain as if it had been waiting empty for outsiders to arrive. That was the fragile foundation beneath the Picts. And for centuries, almost no one had the tools to test it. The deeper problem was that the Picts left behind evidence that felt both abundant and unreachable. They were not invisible. They built power across northern Britain. Their rulers fought Northumbrians, pressured Gaelic kingdoms, dealt with Christian missionaries, and controlled territories from the eastern lowlands toward the northern seas. They were not a minor tribe surviving in a remote corner. For several centuries, they were one of the great forces shaping the future of Scotland. Yet the closer historians looked, the less stable the image became. Their carved stones suggested a society with symbols, rank, memory, and ritual. But the symbols could not be read with confidence. Their language was mentioned by early medieval writers, but almost none of it survived in a form that could be easily translated. Their kings appear in annals and chronicles, but often through sources written by others, after the fact, and with political purposes of their own. Even the word Pict began to look suspicious. Earlier Roman authors had named many distinct northern peoples. Later sources compressed them into one category: Caledonii, Verturiones, Vacomagi, and others were slowly hidden beneath a single outsider label. What looked like one people may have been a patchwork of older communities, joined by geography, pressure, and power. This made the disappearance seem even stranger. If the Picts were a single foreign people, perhaps they could be conquered, absorbed, or erased. But if they were the long-rooted inhabitants of northern Britain, then their supposed vanishing became harder to explain. The stones remained. The names faded. The kingdom changed shape. And beneath the surface, the most important evidence had not yet spoken. The turning point came when the question stopped depending only on chronicles. Ancient DNA gave historians a different kind of witness. Not a monk writing centuries later, not a Roman officer describing enemies beyond a wall, not a carved symbol whose meaning had been lost. The witness was biological, preserved in human remains from Pictish burial sites in Scotland itself. When researchers examined Pictish individuals from regions inside the old heartland of Pictish power, the result cut through 1,000 years of inherited explanation. There was no signal of a founding population from Scythia, no trace of a migration from beyond the Black Sea, no evidence that these people had arrived as outsiders and established themselves over an empty northern land. Instead, their genomes sat firmly within the wider Iron Age British world. They showed continuity with populations that had already been living in Britain long before the name Pict appeared in written sources. Even more important, they showed regional roots. The people buried in Pictish contexts resembled the earlier inhabitants of those same areas more than they resembled some distant ancestral group. This did not make the Picts less mysterious. It made the mystery sharper, because the DNA was not saying that the Picts were a lost race, it was saying the opposite. They were not biologically separate from the deep population history of northern Britain. Their identity could not be explained by a dramatic arrival, a single origin, or a clean ethnic boundary. The old story had imagined a people entering history from elsewhere. The DNA revealed something more unsettling. The people had been there all along. So if Pictish identity did not come from ancestry, then it had to come from power. That is where the meaning of the discovery changes. The Picts were not a biological surprise hidden in the north. They were a political and cultural formation built from older northern communities. A name first applied from outside gradually became something useful inside. Under powerful kings, especially in the kingdom later known as Fortriu, scattered peoples could be drawn into a larger identity. This was not unusual in early medieval Europe. Kingdoms often made peoples as much as peoples made kingdoms. A ruler did not need every valley, coast, and stronghold to share one origin. He needed them to share obedience, tribute, enemies, and eventually a story. Pictishness may have worked like that. The name gathered older tribes into a single frame. Royal genealogies gave the kingdom depth. Legends gave it shape. Symbols carved into stone gave it presence across the landscape. What looked, from a distance, like an ancient ethnic nation may have been something more flexible and more deliberate. A political identity hardened by war, religion, and dynastic ambition. This also changes the question of whether the Picts were Celtic. Their language appears to have belonged to the Brittonic branch of Celtic, related more closely to Welsh, Cornish, and Breton than to Gaelic. So they were Celtic in a linguistic sense. But they were not simply the Gaelic Scotland that later memory projected backward onto them. That distinction matters. The Scotland that emerged after the Viking Age was not created by the disappearance of one population and the arrival of another. It was created when older Pictish communities were absorbed into a new Gaelic political order. The people remained. The name did not. The end of the Picts was not a clean ending. It was a transformation that later writers mistook for disappearance. In the 9th century, Viking attacks tore through the political order of northern Britain. Pictish rulers were killed, dynasties weakened. The balance between Pictland and the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata shifted. Out of that violence came the kingdom of Alba, the foundation of medieval Scotland. From that point, the visible signs of Pictish identity began to fade. The language was absorbed. The old royal lines were rewritten into new histories. The symbol stones stopped appearing. The name Pictland gave way to Alba. By the 12th century, chroniclers could look back and claim that the Picts had vanished, their language extinct, their story almost legendary. But the DNA changes the emotional weight of that claim. It suggests there was no great replacement, no emptying of the north, no vanished race, leaving only stones behind. The people who had carried Pictish identity were still there, living through the new order, marrying into it, speaking new words, serving new kings, and passing their ancestry forward. What vanished was the framework around them. A name imposed by Rome, an identity shaped by kings, a language overtaken by Gaelic, a kingdom broken by war and remade into Scotland. The Picts did not disappear into the mist. They disappeared into continuity. Their monuments became unreadable, their political world collapsed, their name became a mystery. But their descendants remained in the same landscapes, beneath the same weather, beside the same cold coasts. The real disappearance was never in the blood. It was in memory.